I don't know if God's punishing you, but you can't open the door to demons, and demons, there was one lady I heard about who was demon possessed, and the demon was being cast out, and the demon said, I had permission.
Number 1. Pat Robertson. He built a career as the voice of American Christianity, but behind the sermons and broadcasts was a man whose influence reached far beyond the pulpit. Pat Robertson didn't just preach about faith. He built an empire around it. Viewers saw a smiling host on the 700 Club, a man who claimed to heal the sick and speak God's will into politics. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to separate his sermons from the money, the power, and the promises that helped him rise. Pat Robertson was born Marion Gordon Robertson in 1930, the son of a U.S. Senator from Virginia. He didn't begin as a religious figure. In his early years, he studied politics, served briefly in the military, and considered a career in law. But after a personal, religious shift in the 1950s, he claimed he was called to ministry. In 1960, with a loan in a rundown broadcasting station in Virginia, he started what would become the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN. Viewers saw him as calm, authoritative, and trustworthy, a voice that blended religion with national identity. Over time, he evolved from a preacher into a businessman, broadcaster, and political influencer. His television platform reached millions of households, and donations came in constantly. Supporters believed they were helping spread God's message. Few knew how much money was flowing through his organizations or where all of it went. The turning point was his unique approach to faith fundraising. On air, he encouraged donors to give what he called faith gifts, sometimes telling viewers that their donations would lead to blessings or healing. Stories circulated of people sending in their last few dollars because they believed his promises. Meanwhile, Robertson continued to expand CBN, founded Regent University, launched humanitarian groups, and created political coalitions like the Christian Coalition in the 1980s. He positioned himself not just as a preacher, but as a political force, even running for president in 1988. With every expansion came more donations, and with more donations came more questions. Over time, critics, journalists, and former insiders began to investigate how these funds were being used. Reports surfaced about business interests disguised as ministry projects. One of the most controversial examples involved diamond and gold mining ventures in Africa. Robertson claimed these operations were humanitarian efforts, but investigations alleged that profits flowed back into his private dealings and initiatives tied to his network and political reach. There were also questions about tax exemptions. Since many of his entities were classified as religious or charitable, the financial records were rarely made public. For years, critics accused him of using nonprofit donations to support private enterprises, investment projects, and political campaigns. Supporters insisted he was acting in alignment with his mission, but the lack of transparency only deepened suspicion. One story that drew national attention involved Operation Blessing, a charity he founded in the late 1970s. It was promoted as a relief organization, helping people through food, aid, and disaster response. But in the 1990s, news investigations claimed donor money went toward transporting heavy equipment for his mining interests rather than humanitarian projects. Whistleblowers came forward, and documents suggested planes marked as aid flights were allegedly used for business operations in Africa. While no criminal charges followed, the public reaction raised serious doubts about how donations were handled. Viewers who believed they were feeding the hungry wondered if their money had been diverted somewhere else. As scrutiny intensified, so did doubts about the claims made on air. People questioned whether the promises of healing and financial blessings were used to pressure donations. Some viewers said they were encouraged to give even when they couldn't afford it, believing that planting a seed in Robertson's ministries would lead to miracles. Meanwhile, his political statements became more explosive. He blamed natural disasters on social issues and made predictions that never came true. Even those who once supported him started rethinking the way faith was being used in public messaging. Despite the controversies, Robertson remained shielded by the complex structure of his ministries and the protections granted to religious broadcasters. Laws governing financial transparency for churches and religious networks made it difficult to hold anyone accountable. His influence stretched across television networks, universities, charities, and political groups. By the time he stepped back from hosting full-time, his legacy was built on decades of donations from people who believed in his message. Some continued to defend him, saying his work changed lives. Others believed he held spiritual authority over his followers in ways that blurred the line between faith and profit. Pat Robertson died in June 2023 at the age of 93. He left behind a broadcasting empire worth hundreds of millions, multiple nonprofits, and a political footprint that helped shape decades of religious influence in America. But he also left behind unresolved questions. How much of the money raised in God's name funded humanitarian work, and how much supported private deals and political ambitions? How many donors believed their faith was tied to their wallets? In the end, he represents a version of modern televangelism that mixes media power, fundraising, and influence at the highest levels. When a preacher becomes a brand and a ministry becomes an empire, the line between belief and business can disappear. And once it does, the truth about who it serves becomes harder to see. Number 2, Robert Tilton. He didn't rise through quiet sermons or small-town ministry. He exploded onto television screens with energy, promises, and a message built around one idea: if you give to God, God will give back to you. Robert Tilton became one of the most recognizable televangelists of the 1980s and early 1990s. But his empire wasn't built on preaching alone. It was built on mail, money, and the belief that faith could be measured in dollars. Before the scandals and investigations, Tilton was known for his intense delivery and emotional appeals. Born in Texas in 1946, he started his ministry in the 1970s and quickly moved into television, where the real growth began. By the 1980s, his show Success in Life aired nationwide, bringing in tens of millions of dollars every year. Viewers saw him pray over stacks of letters, place his hands on envelopes, and claim he could feel healing and miracles through the screen. For many struggling families, his voice sounded like hope dressed as certainty. The money poured in because of one major tactic, what he called seed faith giving. He told viewers that sending donations to his ministry would trigger blessings in their finances, health, and relationships. People mailed checks, cash, and written prayer requests by the thousands. The show's production team pushed a constant cycle of need and reward, telling believers that their breakthrough depended on their sacrifice. Tilton encouraged amounts that stretched far beyond what many viewers could afford. Some sent grocery money, rent money, or retirement savings because they believed his promises. For a long time, the donations stayed hidden behind the image he presented: a charismatic preacher with a direct line to God's favor. But in 1991, everything changed when reporters from ABC's Primetime Live launched an undercover investigation. What they discovered shocked the public. Prayer requests sent by viewers were allegedly being discarded while checks were extracted and processed separately. Former employees claimed letters were opened by staff who removed the money and then threw away the rest. Viewers who believed their words were being read and prayed over learned that their messages might not have been seen at all. The investigation triggered lawsuits, federal scrutiny, and a wave of media attention. Trinity Foundation, a watchdog group in Texas, helped expose the operation, revealing how donation mail was funneled into businesses that tracked how much each person could be persuaded to send. Some reports allege that people who donated larger amounts were specifically targeted for more aggressive mail campaigns. Tilton denied wrongdoing and insisted that prayer requests were read and handled properly, but the damage was already spreading. As more details surfaced, critics questioned where the donations were going. Reports showed he was living in luxury, buying expensive homes, investing in properties, and using ministry funds to support his lifestyle. At the height of his fame, his ministry was taking in an estimated $80 million per year, all tax exempt. Viewers who once saw him as a spiritual leader now wondered if they had funded personal wealth under the promise of divine reward. Legal challenges followed, but criminal charges never materialized. The lawsuits focused on fraud, deceptive fundraising, and mail-related misconduct, but most cases were settled or dismissed. Still, his reputation collapsed. His television show was pulled from most major stations, donations dried up, and by the mid-1990s, his national influence had all but vanished. For a time, he retreated from public preaching and faced financial decline. But he didn't disappear entirely. In the 2000s, Tilton slowly attempted a comeback on smaller religious networks and online platforms, rebranding parts of his ministry while keeping the same core message: give money, expect blessings. The scale was smaller, but the strategy was familiar. He continued to present himself as a prophet of success, even as the legacy of the investigations followed him. Today, Robert Tilton remains a controversial figure tied to one of the most well-known televangelist scandals in American history. He was never convicted of a crime, yet his name became synonymous with mail fraud accusations and donation manipulation. He once told his viewers that God moved through envelopes and offerings. Now, his legacy serves as a cautionary tale about what can happen when spiritual trust is traded for profit, and when promises of blessings are tied to the size of a check. Number 3, Paula White-Cain. She stood in stadiums, on television stages, and behind the presidential podium, presenting herself as a spiritual advisor with a direct link to divine favor. Paula White-Cain built her identity around prosperity, purpose, and authority. But behind the sermons were financial controversies, accusations of exploitation, and a ministry shaped by wealth as much as worship. Paula White was born in Mississippi in 1966 and faced early hardship. She often spoke about childhood trauma, family struggles, and finding faith in her late teens. That testimony helped build her appeal. She wasn't born into power, she rose into it. In the 1990s, she co-founded Without Walls International Church in Florida with her then-husband, Randy White. The church exploded in attendance, drawing thousands with promises of restoration and financial breakthrough. Televised sermons followed, and by the early 2000s, she was a well-known figure in the world of prosperity preaching. Her message always linked faith to success. She told followers that tithing and giving directly to her ministry would activate blessings over their lives. Viewers and congregants were encouraged to send first fruits offerings, sometimes described as the first paycheck of the year, or special donations tied to miracles, healing, and personal turnaround. Those who hesitated were told they might be blocking their own blessings. The message was hopeful on the surface, but carried a quiet pressure. Give more, believe more, and trust that God would return it in multiplied form. Questions about money began to surface as her lifestyle became more visible. She lived in upscale homes, traveled by private jets, and wore designer clothing while preaching about sacrifice and faith. Reports of expensive renovations, high ministry salaries, and undisclosed financial dealings raised concerns. In 2007, she and several other televangelists were named in a U.S. Senate inquiry led by Senator Chuck Grassley. The investigation looked into the misuse of donations, compensation practices, and whether ministries like hers were operating more like religious corporations than churches. White declined to fully cooperate, and while no charges resulted, the lack of transparency left lingering suspicion. As the scrutiny grew, her church in Tampa began to struggle. Without walls faced lawsuits, debt, and public controversy. Congregants alleged that they were pushed for donations even when the church was behind on bills, and staff were unpaid. At one point, the building was reportedly facing foreclosure. Meanwhile, White expanded her influence beyond the pulpit. She published books, went on national tours, and became a regular voice on Christian television. Her words often returned to the idea that financial faithfulness would unlock God's favor, even as critics pointed to her growing wealth. Another turning point came in her personal life. Her divorce from Randy White became public in 2007, and rumors of an inappropriate relationship with another televangelist, Benny Hinn, surfaced after they were photographed holding hands. Both denied any affair, but it damaged her reputation among conservative followers. She continued preaching and rebranded under the name Paula White Ministries, building an individual platform apart from the church she had helped create. Then came the political chapter. Paula White became a spiritual advisor to Donald Trump and frequently appeared alongside him during his presidential campaign and time in office. She prayed publicly at events, held faith meetings at the White House, and used her platform to combine religious authority with political messaging. Her prominence grew, but so did criticism that she was using faith for influence and personal gain. She also promoted fundraising campaigns tied to prayer support, offering spiritual covering in exchange for donations. Throughout the years, former church members and ministry insiders claimed that giving was heavily emphasized and sometimes tied to promises of healing, protection, or increased income. Investigations by journalists found that she had set up multiple limited liability companies, making it difficult to trace where donations ended up. Her defenders said she was being targeted because of her success and political connections. Detractors argued that her ministry model relied more on emotional pressure than genuine charity. Despite decades of public scrutiny, Paula White has never faced legal charges over financial practices. She continues to preach, speak, and run ministry operations, maintaining a loyal following among believers who see her as a voice of authority. But her legacy is inseparable from the questions that follow her. How much of the money went to spreading faith? And how much went to supporting a lifestyle few of her viewers could imagine affording? She often spoke of obedience, favor, and breakthrough, urging people to give even in times of personal struggle. Whether they were supporting a ministry or funding a brand is a question that still divides opinions. In the end, Paula White became a symbol of modern televangelism, a blend of charisma, influence, and controversy, where the name of God was often tied to the price of belief. Number 4. T.B. Joshua. To millions of followers around the world, he was seen as a miracle worker, a man who could heal the sick, predict the future, and speak with supernatural authority. But behind the televised crusades and emotional testimonies, T.B. Joshua built a movement surrounded by secrecy, questions about money, and accusations of exploitation that followed him across continents. Temitope Balogun. Joshua was born in Nigeria in 1963. He often told stories of a humble beginning, dropping out of school early, working odd jobs, and claiming spiritual visions from a young age. In 1987, he founded the synagogue, Church of All Nations, Hes Koan, on the outskirts of Lagos. It started small, but grew at a staggering pace, gaining attention through dramatic healing claims and televised deliverances. His sermons drew thousands in person and millions through broadcasts across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. People traveled from around the world to his church in search of cures, blessings, or answers. He welcomed high-profile visitors, including politicians, athletes, and entertainers. Testimonies were shown on Emmanuel TV, the ministry's media arm, featuring crowds weeping, collapsing, and declaring instant healing from illnesses and disabilities. Yet behind the stage lights and applause, critics questioned how these events were orchestrated and whether they were real at all. As the ministry expanded, so did its financial reach. Followers were encouraged to support SCOAN with offerings, pledges, and special donations tied to healing and prophecy. Wealthy guests often contributed large sums, while ordinary believers gave out of desperation and faith. Joshua's influence extended into international charity projects, but financial records were tightly controlled. Churches in other countries were linked to his name, and leaders were trained under his doctrine and funding system. One of the most controversial moments of his ministry came in 2014. A guest house on the Scone property collapsed, killing 116 people, many of them foreign visitors who had come for spiritual programs. Investigations revealed that the building had been constructed without proper approvals and potentially violated safety standards. Families demanded accountability, and Nigerian authorities filed charges related to negligence. Joshua denied wrongdoing and suggested external forces were responsible, but the legal process dragged on for years. Critics argued the incident revealed how his organization operated, without oversight, even when lives were at risk. There were also accusations from former insiders who described the ministry as controlling and fear-based. Some alleged that people were instructed to stop taking medical treatment to prove their faith in healing. Others said testimonies were staged or exaggerated. Reports emerged of followers giving significant amounts of money in exchange for private sessions and spiritual favors. Joshua rarely responded directly to these claims, choosing instead to focus on messages about faith, obedience, and sacrifice. Despite controversies, his influence only grew. He held international crusades, built relationships with global ministers, and positioned himself as a prophetic figure to entire nations. Government officials visited his church and requested his prayers. Media coverage alternated between fascination and suspicion. For his loyal supporters, he was a man chosen by God. For his critics, he was a powerful figure operating without accountability. T.B. Joshua died in June 2021 at the age of 57, reportedly after a church service. His sudden death sparked mourning across multiple countries, with thousands gathering to honor him. But it also left behind unresolved questions about his ministry, finances, and claims of supernatural power. Leadership of SCOAN was later taken over by his widow, but fractures within the organization began to surface as internal control and assets were contested. Even after his death, investigations and lawsuits continued. Families of victims from the building collapse still seek closure. Former followers continue to speak out about manipulation, staged miracles, and financial pressure. Yet many people still watch his recordings, share his sermons, and repeat the testimonies they believe came from him. T.B. Joshua built a legacy on spectacle, conviction, and promises of divine intervention. But his rise also exposed how faith can become a gateway for unchecked power, especially when surrounded by followers who are desperate for hope. His ministry presented healing as proof of calling and sacrifice as proof of devotion. He once said that faith without action is meaningless. Number 5, David Oyedepo. He rose from a small Bible study group in Nigeria to leading one of the largest church empires in the world. David Oyedepo built his image around prosperity, faith, and divine favor. But his wealth, influence, and teachings about money sparked global debate about whether he was spreading the gospel or profiting from belief. David Oyedepo was born in 1954 in Kwara State, Nigeria. He studied architecture before turning fully to ministry, claiming he had a divine encounter in the late 1970s that called him to serve. In 1981, he founded Living Faith Church Worldwide, better known as Winners Chapel. It started modestly but expanded rapidly across Nigeria and then internationally. By the 2000s, his churches existed in dozens of countries, and millions followed his teachings through broadcasts, books, and satellite services. He preached what became known as the prosperity message, the idea that faith, obedience, and giving could unlock material blessings. Members were told that offerings, tithes, and sacrificial giving were pathways to promotion and protection. Churches under his name encouraged first fruit offerings, building funds, and special donations tied to spiritual breakthroughs. Supporters believed they were honoring God. Critics claimed it exploited desperation. As the church grew, so did the wealth surrounding it. In 1999, Oyedepo built Faith Tabernacle in Ota, Nigeria, a 50,000-seat megachurch on a sprawling campus known as Canaan Land. The property included schools, residential estates, a publishing house, a university, and businesses connected to the ministry. He later founded Covenant University and Landmark University, both private institutions with high tuition fees. The church's operations brought in significant revenue, but financial transparency was minimal. Over the years, Oyedepo acquired private jets, estates, and global real estate. His estimated net worth placed him among the richest pastors in the world. Supporters defended him, saying he funded education, employment, and charity. Others argued that the money flowed upward while many of his followers struggled financially. Videos surfaced of him telling congregants that not tithing was equivalent to stealing from God and that poverty could be broken through higher giving. Those messages often targeted people already facing economic hardship. Controversy escalated as journalists and former members began speaking out. Financial disclosures were not released to the public, and revenue from books, schools, and offerings was shielded under church ownership. Some questioned whether ministry funds were being used to maintain private jets and luxury homes. Others raised concerns about how much control he held over church assets and how those at the bottom were pressured into giving repeatedly. Beyond finances, he faced backlash over public remarks. In 2011, he was recorded slapping a young woman during a church service after accusing her of witchcraft. The video spread widely, sparking outrage, but the incident never resulted in prosecution. He continued preaching and expanding his influence, undeterred by criticism. Despite mounting scrutiny, Oyedepo retained strong loyalty among followers who viewed him as a man chosen by God to lead Africa's Christian movement. His teachings promised that faith could overcome any limitation and that wealth was a sign of divine favor. The more he prospered, the more his success became part of the sermon. Authorities in different countries began paying closer attention to financial operations tied to his ministry. In 2021, the United Kingdom revoked the charity status of his church branch there, citing concerns about how funds were being used. Questions followed about international branches and whether they functioned more like businesses than places of worship. Yet through all of it, he continued traveling, preaching, and building. Today, David Oyedepo remains one of the most influential religious figures in Africa, but he also stands as a symbol of how wealth and faith can become intertwined in ways that blur accountability. Supporters see him as proof that God rewards obedience. Number 6. Shepherd Bushiri. To his followers, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a prophet, a man who claimed to hear directly from God and deliver miracles on command. Shepherd Bushiri built a global ministry around healing, wealth, and prophecy. But as the spotlight grew, so did the allegations of fraud, deception, and financial exploitation. Shepherd Bushiri was born in Malawi in 1983 and began preaching at a young age. In the 2000s, he founded the Enlightened Christian Gathering Church, commonly called ECG. His services drew massive crowds in South Africa, Botswana, and beyond. He preached prosperity, declaring that faith and giving would bring financial turnaround. People flooded his events hoping for healing, jobs, and breakthroughs. Television broadcasts and live streams helped him expand rapidly, turning him into a celebrity pastor across Africa. His image was built around wealth. He traveled by private jet, drove luxury cars, and wore expensive suits, presenting his success as evidence of divine favor. Followers saw his lifestyle as something to aspire to rather than question. He hosted conferences in stadiums, sold anointed oils, and promoted partner programs where members pledged ongoing financial support to be part of his inner circle. The message was consistent: give to the ministry and expect God to move. But while his influence spread, so did the scrutiny. Authorities and watchdogs began asking how his ministry handled the millions it received. In South Africa, where his church was based, allegations emerged that funds were laundered through ministry accounts and businesses connected to him and his wife, Mary. Investigators claimed that donations were not just used for church operations, but moved across borders through illegal channels. He denied all wrongdoing and said the accusations were attacks on his faith. The turning point came in 2019 when a stampede at one of his church events in Pretoria led to multiple deaths. Critics accused the ministry of negligence, claiming the gathering was overcrowded and safety protocols were ignored. The church allegedly delayed notifying authorities and families, which drew public outrage. Bushiri continued holding services, but questions about accountability only intensified. By 2020, the South African government charged him and his wife with fraud, theft, and money laundering. Investigators alleged they defrauded followers through fake investment schemes and used church funds to move the equivalent of millions of dollars out of the country. They were arrested and released on bail, but before the trial could begin, the couple fled South Africa and resurfaced in Malawi. They claimed their lives were in danger and that the legal system would not treat them fairly. South Africa requested their extradition, and legal proceedings began in Malawi, but the process stalled. Meanwhile, his followers continued to defend him, saying he was being persecuted for his faith and success. Even after fleeing, he continued preaching online and holding events, keeping his ministry alive through digital platforms and church branches in other countries. His critics argued that his teachings encouraged blind loyalty and financial dependence. Former members spoke out, claiming they were pressured to give money in exchange for promised miracles, jobs, or business success. Despite facing charges that could lead to decades in prison, Bushiri remains active in ministry. His influence across Malawi and parts of southern Africa still draws attention, and extradition efforts continue. Donations have not disappeared, and many followers insist the legal cases are fabrications meant to destroy a man favored by God. Shepherd Bushiri once said that true faith must be proven through sacrifice. Number 7, Paulo Macedo. He wasn't a household name in the United States, but in Brazil and parts of Europe, Paulo Macedo became a symbol of religious power tied directly to wealth. As the founder of one of the most influential neo-Pentecostal organizations in the world, he built a ministry that reached millions, and a fortune that sparked accusations of fraud, money laundering, and exploitation masked as faith. Paulo Macedo, often referred to as Edir Macedo, was born in 1945 in Rio de Janeiro. He began his career working modest jobs but shifted toward preaching in the 1970s. In 1977, he founded the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, known in Brazil as Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus. His message centered on prosperity, healing, and deliverance from curses, leading worshipers to believe that giving money directly to the church would break spiritual and financial hardship. His rise was fast and aggressive. The church held services in renovated cinemas, bus stations, and stadiums, drawing in people from working-class communities with promises of breakthroughs. Pastors under his leadership pushed a consistent message: sacrifice financially, and God would return blessings many times over. Donations came in through tithes, sacrificial campaigns, and offerings tied to healing and deliverance. Followers often gave beyond their means, convinced that generosity was proof of faith. By the 1980s and 1990s, Macedo's empire expanded beyond worship centers. He acquired radio stations, television channels, businesses, and real estate. In 1989, he bought Rede Record, one of the largest television networks in Brazil, which amplified his message and boosted political influence. Critics argued that donations meant for ministry were being routed into media ownership and private business. Over time, journalists and investigators began tracking church finances. Reports surfaced of pastors instructed to pressure members into giving more, even when families were in debt. Some former members claimed they were told to sell cars or property to participate in high-tier campaigns promising divine intervention. Meanwhile, Macedo's personal wealth expanded. He bought luxury homes in the United States, Brazil, and Europe, along with private aircraft and commercial real estate. In the early 2000s, Brazilian authorities charged him and several senior church members with money laundering, embezzlement, and using shell companies to hide church income. Government investigators claimed that donations were funneled through a network of international accounts and real estate purchases disguised as ministry investments. Macedo denied the accusations and insisted that the charges were driven by religious and political persecution. Despite the legal scrutiny, his influence continued to grow. His church spread to over 100 countries, including branches in Africa, Europe, and the United States. In places like Portugal and Angola, officials also raised concerns about how money was collected and moved across borders. Yet membership rarely declined. The church appealed to those seeking hope, healing, and prosperity, and Macedo presented his wealth as biblical proof that his teachings worked. In 2011, Brazil's Supreme Court dismissed one of the major criminal cases against him, citing insufficient evidence for conviction. But controversy never fully disappeared. International authorities and investigative reporters continued tracking financial activities linked to his ministry. Meanwhile, he published books defending prosperity theology and positioned himself as a successful example of faith in action. His political ties only deepened his reach. Members of his church were elected to public office, and he used his television networks to influence elections and promote religious ideology in government. Critics claim that his media control allowed him to shape public perception, downplay legal scrutiny, and silence dissent. Today, Paulo Macedo is considered one of the wealthiest religious figures in the world. Estimates place his net worth in the billions. His organization still collects donations daily through its global branches, urging followers to tithe, sow financial seeds, and participate in annual campaigns of sacrifice. Paulo Macedo built a system that promised transformation through giving and obedience. Those who followed him believed they were placing their trust in God. Number 8, Morris Cerullo. For decades, he traveled the world claiming to heal the sick, cast out illness, and deliver people from financial hardship, if they partnered with his ministry. Morris Cerullo built his name through crusades, broadcasts, and dramatic promises of miracles, but his rise drew repeated investigations into whether faith was being used as a tool for profit rather than salvation. Morris Cerullo was born in New Jersey in 1931 and spent part of his childhood in an orphanage after losing both parents. He later said he experienced a spiritual calling as a teenager and began preaching in his early 20s. By the 1960s, he was traveling internationally, holding revival events across Latin America, Africa, and Europe. His style relied on bold declarations of healing and the power of giving. The more his events grew, the more donations followed. He founded Morris Cerullo World Evangelism, a ministry that operated television programming, conferences, and missionary training centers. He regularly spoke about sowing seed into God's work, telling followers that their offerings would release breakthroughs in health, finances, and family life. Letters from supporters poured in, often accompanied by checks and cash from people who believed that partnering with him would unlock divine favor. As the ministry expanded, concerns followed closely. Governments in multiple countries began monitoring his activities. In India and Nigeria, he was temporarily barred from entering after critics accused him of promoting misleading claims of healing. In the United Kingdom, regulators investigated the way his organization solicited money from vulnerable people. Some events included segments where attendees in wheelchairs or with chronic conditions were brought forward for what appeared to be staged or unverified healings. One of the most public controversies erupted in the 1990s and 2000s when British authorities reviewed his fundraising methods. Donors reported being asked to give money to secure blessings, cure illness, or end personal hardship. Some said they were pressured through letters promising miracles in return for specific amounts. Complaints led to scrutiny from media watchdogs and charity regulators who questioned whether the ministry was exploiting desperation. Investigators in other areas raised similar concerns. Critics alleged his organization often advertised charitable outreach, but financial transparency was limited. Reports claim that funds were used to support televised promotions, conferences, and property acquisitions rather than direct humanitarian aid. Cerullo denied wrongdoing and maintained that every donation was part of a biblical mission. In the United States, his television programs and mail campaigns emphasized prosperity themes. Believers were told that their giving would put them in a position to receive blessings 100-fold. He also sold ministry partnership packages, prayer kits, and religious materials tied to promises of healing and prosperity. Some former supporters later said they felt manipulated into giving money they couldn't afford after being told it was a test of faith. Despite frequent criticism, Cerullo continued operating globally. His events drew large crowds, particularly in parts of Africa and Latin America, where hope and poverty often intersected. He presented himself as a prophet and spiritual general, claiming to train others to perform miracles through his schools of ministry. His organization produced magazines, broadcasts, and live events designed to expand membership and increase giving. As the ministry's influence grew, so did its resources. Cerullo invested in religious facilities, media production centers, and international campaigns. Watchdog groups questioned how much of that money came from high-pressure solicitation aimed at people in crisis. Others pointed to testimonies that never produced evidence beyond staged moments caught on camera. Even in his later years, he remained active in ministry work. He relocated operations to California and launched new projects, including a religious theme center designed to preserve his teachings. Morris Cerullo died in 2020 at the age of 88, leaving behind a ministry that spanned more than 70 years. His legacy is divided sharply. To some, he was a servant of God who changed lives. Number 9, Juanita Bynum. She rose to fame as a powerful preacher, author, and gospel figure with a testimony that drew people in. Juanita Bynum spoke about pain, recovery, and spiritual breakthrough, and audiences saw her as a voice for those who had struggled and overcome. But as her influence and wealth grew, so did accusations that her ministry relied on emotional pressure, financial manipulation, and lavish spending funded by believers who trusted her message. Juanita Bynum was born in Chicago in 1959 and grew up in a religious family. Her early life had real hardship. She talked publicly about past abuse, failed relationships, and times when she felt broken. Those personal stories helped her connect with followers, especially women who saw her as someone who had survived what they were facing. Her breakthrough moment came in 1997 when she preached a sermon called No More Sheets, a message about leaving behind destructive cycles. That message went viral in church circles, and her career changed overnight. By the early 2000s, Bynum became one of the most recognizable women in American televangelism. She preached at major conferences, released books and albums, and made frequent television appearances. People called her the prophetess, and she was invited to speak in packed arenas. With her growing platform came a steady increase in donations. Ministries tied to her name held events that charged registration fees, sold exclusive seating, and encouraged offerings tied to personal breakthroughs. Her marriage to Bishop Thomas Weeks III in 2002 became a national spectacle. Their televised wedding was described as a $1 million ceremony featuring designer gowns, luxury cars, and celebrity guests. Supporters celebrated it as a symbol of God's favor. Critics saw it as a sign that prosperity culture had overshadowed humility. Even after the wedding, the couple held the relationship conferences and wrote books about faith and marriage, promoting teachings that tied spiritual success to obedience and giving. Everything shifted in 2007 when the marriage collapsed publicly. Bynum was assaulted by Weeks in a hotel parking lot, and the case made national headlines. He eventually pled guilty to aggravated assault. She spoke about the incident as part of her testimony and positioned herself again as a voice for healing and survival. But behind the scenes, her reputation began to splinter. Members of her ministry said donations were still heavily pushed, even while she navigated legal disputes, personal debts, and declining public trust. Reports emerged that her lifestyle remained expensive. Luxury travel, high-end clothing, and properties linked to her ministry. She continued hosting conferences where attendees were encouraged to give sacrificial offerings. At some events, she asked people to sow seed money of $1,000 or more, promising that God would break financial and personal barriers in return. Some followers claimed they felt pressured or misled into giving beyond their means. Financial problems eventually became public. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Bynum faced lawsuits over unpaid debts, repossessed property, and defaulted contracts. One case involved allegations that she failed to repay loans tied to event appearances. Another involved a promoter who claimed she breached agreements after receiving advance money. Despite these issues, she continued to speak about prosperity and divine increase. As her influence declined in mainstream circles, she adapted her ministry brand. She sold online courses, prayer packages, and partnerships that required paid enrollment. At times, she offered prophetic access for donors who contributed at higher levels. Followers were urged to give specific amounts tied to spiritual declarations. $300 for one blessing cycle, $1,000 for another. Critics argued that the messaging blurred the line between faith and coercion. In later years, she reemerged through social media and virtual ministry. She held live broadcasts where viewers were asked to donate during prayers. The tone remained consistent: Generosity was tied directly to spiritual transformation. Supporters continued to honor her as a leader who spoke to brokenness and restoration. Juanita Bynum built a legacy on emotional storytelling, powerful delivery, and the promise that faith could repair any life. But the same platform that gave her influence also opened doors to unchecked fundraising. Number 10, Rod Parsley. He built his reputation on fiery sermons, urgent prophecies, and declarations that financial giving could change destinies. Rod Parsley became one of the most recognizable televangelists in the United States, but as his influence grew, so did the concerns about how his ministry handled money, pressured donations, and blurred the line between faith and profit. Rod Parsley was born in 1957 in Cleveland, Ohio, and raised in a religious household. In the early 1980s, he founded World Harvest Church near Columbus, starting with just a few dozen members. His intense preaching style and bold claims about miracles drew attention. As his congregation grew, his services became a blend of revival energy, prophecy, and appeals for giving. He launched television broadcasts through Breakthrough, a program that eventually reached millions of households across the country. Parsley framed giving not as charity, but as a spiritual transaction. He preached that financial seed offerings would lead to breakthroughs, healing, debt cancellation, promotions, and protection from hardship. Viewers were urged to give specific amounts tied to prophetic themes: $40 for freedom, $100 for restoration, $1,000 for covenant blessings. Those who didn't give were warned they might block their own miracles. His messages often targeted people in crisis, presenting sowing money into his ministry as an act of obedience that would unlock God's favor. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Parsley expanded aggressively. World Harvest Church grew into a multi-million-dollar complex with a private school, ministry network, and television studios. Donations funded large conferences, media campaigns, and political activism. He became a prominent religious voice in conservative politics, supporting legislation and candidates aligned with his beliefs. But behind the sermons and national appearances, questions surfaced about accountability and spending. One major controversy came from fundraising appeals tied to specific promises. In some broadcasts, Parsley claimed that those who gave during atmospheres of anointing would see urgent breakthroughs within days. Former donors later reported that they were contacted repeatedly for more money, with staff using personal details from prayer requests to increase pressure. Watchdog groups criticized the emotional tactics and lack of transparency in how donations were used. Financial records from his ministry were not open to the public, shielded by religious classification. Yet reports showed that World Harvest paid large salaries to key leaders and invested heavily in media production. A portion of ministry funds supported political causes and ballot campaigns, raising further scrutiny over whether donor money was being used as advertised. Parsley also became entangled in legal trouble unrelated to donations. In 2006, his church's private school was sued after a 3-year-old child was severely injured by a teacher using corporal punishment. A jury awarded the family millions in damages, and the case raised concerns about oversight within his institutions. Around the same time, reporters began investigating his ministry's finances and questioning how much money was going to personal and political ventures. Despite the criticism, Parsley continued promoting prosperity teachings. He released books, toured churches, and hosted television specials built around breakthrough offerings. Even when donations dipped, he adapted by moving appeals to online platforms, live stream services, and targeted campaigns promising deliverance from debt and illness. Former insiders claimed that ministry employees were trained to encourage recurring donations and identify high-value givers. Some said the organization operated like a business disguised as a church, with constant financial targets and scripted appeals. Parsley denied exploiting followers and stated that all giving was voluntary and biblically inspired. Today, he still leads World Harvest Church and maintains a nationwide media presence. Though his influence has waned from its peak, he continues to speak with the same energy that first launched his career, commanding, urgent, and tied to offerings.